Hey everybody. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the Cold War and comic books. We're going to talk about post-World War II American foreign policy, the strategy of containment to try and bottle up the Soviet Union and prevent it from expanding. And then we're going to talk about how this was reflected in comic books. Both the external fight between the United States and Soviet Union, but also the fear of communist ideology infiltrating the United States and the home front. All right, so let's get into this. Let's talk about American foreign policy after World War II. Before World War II, the United States and Soviet Union did not like each other. America disliked the Russian Revolution that allowed the communists to take over in the Soviet Union, what now became the Soviet Union. In fact, America actually sent military aid to try and prevent the communists from taking over. When the Soviets learned their origin story of the glorious communist revolution, they learned that America actively tried to prevent that from happening. For the United States was very threatened by the growth of Soviet communism, and there was tension between the two countries before World War II. However, as we talked about in our swing music unit, the Soviet Union in particular became more friendly to the United States on the eve of World War II, perceiving that it might need allies in an eventual war against Germany. When war does break out, the United States and the Soviet Union end up on the same side of the war. The United States and the Soviet Union were allies during World War II. Once again, as I talked about before, this was not out of some inherent love between the two nations, but rather both the United States and Soviet Union had a more immediate threat, and that was Germany, also Japan to a certain extent. So during World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union fought as allies. But as the war was coming to an end, it was clear there were going to be two great powers left after World War II. That was the United States and the Soviet Union. I talked in a previous lecture that the United States comes out of World War II in this rather remarkable position. Not only does, for a while, the United States have a nuclear monopoly, but the United States, the American infrastructure is left intact, other than Pearl Harbor. All of World War II took place away from American soil. So the United States was in a prime position, both economically and militarily, coming out of World War II. The Soviet Union suffered tens of millions of deaths during the war. And a significant amount of warfare happened on Soviet soil, and there was damage to the Soviet infrastructure. But nonetheless, the Soviets had built up such a large army, both in terms of personnel and in terms of things like tanks and airplanes, that they were going to remain a power after the war. A lot of Americans' allies, England, France, they were going to be in a kind of rebuilding mode after the war. So there were going to be two great powers. And without the threat of the Germans, the United States looked at the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union looked at the United States after World War II and remembered they did not like each other. Remembered that their systems, the American capitalist democratic system and the Soviet totalitarian communist system, were incompatible with one another, or at least that was the perception on both sides. And so as World War II comes to an end, the United States and the Soviet Union snap back into a rivalry. And this was particularly acute because at this point, there were two great powers left. And in international systems, when there are two great powers on the global scale, they tend to view each other as rivals. They don't have to, but historically there's a tendency when there are two great powers that one side is threatened by the other because they sit back and think, there's really only one other nation that poses a threat to me, and it's nation X. And nation Y looks back and says, nation X looks and says, there's only one real power that is a threat to us, and that is nation Y. And that very much is going on with the United States and Soviet Union. By 1947, by 1948, the United States is, well, let me take that back. Even before the war was over, the United States was threatened by certain moves that the Soviets were doing towards the end of war and would accelerate as the war was over. One of the things that the Soviets was tired of is continually throughout their history being invaded by European powers, particularly from Central Europe. Every 20, 40, 50 years, some European power marched or pointed their armies east and marched on Mother Russia. Napoleon had done it. The Germans had done it multiple times. And coming out of World War II, the Soviets wanted a buffer zone. So as the Soviet armies marched towards Germany and marched through Eastern Europe, the Soviets created a buffer zone. They occupied Eastern European countries like Poland, like Czechoslovakia, like Hungary, and kept Soviet troops and installed pro-Soviet communist governments throughout Eastern Europe. This for the Soviets seemed rational. We're tired of getting invaded from the rest of Europe. We are going to create a buffer zone, so if the Germans or the English or the French try to invade us, they're going to have to slug their way through Eastern Europe before they get to Mother Russia. That seemed rational to the Soviets. To the Americans, that seemed very provocative and threatening. After all, what was it that made the German threats before World War II so problematic? The Germans had been invading neighbors, taking over European territory. And now from the American perspective, the Americans just get finished with defeating the Germans, and now the Soviets are starting to act just like the Germans had. Invading neighbors, keeping armies in there, and from what the Soviets were doing is installing friendly governments under threat of Soviet occupation. These Eastern European countries didn't really have much in the way of choice. And so the United States has this traditional rivalry with the Soviets that was suspended during World War II because they had the enemy of the Germans. And now the Soviets are acting in threatening ways from the American perspective. By 1947, 1948, the United States is developing a strategy for dealing with what the Americans perceive as Soviet aggression, Soviet expansion. And that strategy comes to be known as containment. You see it sort of illustrated here in this image. The goal of American foreign policy from the late 40s, really into the early 1990s, was to try to prevent Soviet expansion by preventing the spread of communism from where it already existed. So in 1947, 1948, that was the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The United States, in the beginning, the focus was on preventing Soviet expansion from certain vital industrial areas around the world. Central and Western Europe, obviously the United States itself. Japan, who was rapidly becoming an American ally after the war. Keep the Soviets from expanding to these vital areas. As time goes on, the threat of a Soviet expansion becomes anywhere in the globe. Prevent the Soviets from expanding anywhere. That becomes the central focus of American foreign policy. And what develops between the late 40s and the early 90s is a kind of zero-sum game competition between the Americans and the Soviet Union. A zero-sum game is when an advantage of one side it becomes an equal disadvantage to the other side. If the Soviets gained hypothetically 10%, that would mean that is a 10% loss for the United States. In other words, in a zero-sum game, both sides can't be succeeding, can't be winning. One side gets advantage and the other side proportionally loses. So from the American perspective, any expansion of communist influence in the world was viewed as a loss to the United States. So therefore, the United States had to prevent Soviet expansion anywhere in the world, anywhere in the globe. Now, the Cold War is called the Cold War because this war never got hot. What happened was that by 1949, the Soviets exploded their first nuclear weapon, which was shocking to the United States. The Americans thought it was going to take the Soviets a lot longer than that. So after 1949, any actual war that was going to be fought between the United States and Soviet Union, any consideration of war or increasing pressure on each side, the countries would have to calculate. This could lead to nuclear war. So, is it worth risking a direct confrontation with the United States or Soviet Union? Both sides had to worry about this. This could lead to nuclear war. Is it worth it? And throughout this entire period, the answer was always no. We cannot directly confront the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union cannot directly confront the United States. It's not worth it because this could lead to nuclear war. This becomes more acute as time goes on, and both nations' nuclear stockpile and ability to deliver nuclear weapons becomes more sophisticated. The answer was no, we can't risk it. But between the late 40s and early 90s, the United States and Soviet Union fought each other through proxy, through picking allies in warfare all around the globe. Between the late 40s and early 90s, just about every civil war that happened in the world had support from one side from the United States and the other side from the Soviet Union, giving weapons, giving arms, giving military training. So throughout the globe, there were these proxy wars where the United States and Soviet Union were not directly confronting each other. The war between the United States and Soviet Union never got hot. There weren't Americans and Soviets, for the most part, firing guns at each other. But American and Soviet allies were doing that. Vietnam would be a good example of where a war like this started, where the Soviets were supporting the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, and the United States was supporting the South Vietnamese. Eventually, the Americans get involved in this war, but they never directly fought the Soviets there because the Soviets understood we don't want this war to go hot. Later on, the Soviets invade Afghanistan and start to fight the Afghanis. The Americans start to back the Afghanis, give them weapons, give them money, but never actually send troops there to go and confront. The risk was always too great. So the war remained cold, but it was fought all around in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. So much of world conflict between the late 40s and 90s was about pawns in the battle of the Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union. Well, this was reflected in comic books during the time. The Soviet Union became the great enemy, and a growing genre of comic books were military-themed combat comic books. These started during World War II and would continue on. G.I. Joe. Let's take a look down here. G.I. Joe becomes a popular comic book character. This is G.I. Joe here. If you look at G.I. Joe comic book covers from the period, they're always so bizarre because G.I. Joe always has this really weird smile on his face. I mean, the guy's he's got this crazy sociopathic smile because he's not just fighting because he has to, but this guy's having a good time. And he's not only doing that, he's got a puppy with him. He's shooting communists in the back. It's a very bizarre comic book. And so this gets reflected. Now, Brad Wright has a very interesting discussion of the evolution of these military comic books. Because one of the things that happens during the Cold War is that the United States starts engaging in conflicts in which the Americans only use a percentage of their military power to defeat their enemies. During World War II was a total war. The United States converted its entire economy into a war economy, sent millions of men and some women in uniform overseas to fight this war, and it was a total war effort. And to defeat the Japanese and the Germans, the Americans marched their troops all the way into Berlin, utterly obliterated German defenses, and required total surrender by the Germans, 100%. The United States drops nuclear weapons, atomic weapons, on Japan. It demands total surrender. It was a 100% war effort, and the demand of the Americans was going to be on not settling for peace terms early on, but rather, we are going to completely conquer you, and after we completely conquer you, we are going to dictate the terms that you will surrender. You will do exactly what we tell you because you have no other choice. There's something straightforward, simplistic about that. That is easy to understand. But during the Cold War, remember, now the Americans always have this calculation in their rivalry with the Soviet Union. If we increase pressure on the Soviets or their proxies, other countries that are supported by the Soviet Union, if we start applying pressure, we always need to remember it might get to the point where the Soviets feel so threatened, they will start dropping atomic weapons on the United States. Is this worth it? And the answer was often, well, it's worth it to a point, but we won't go the whole way. So, for example, in 1950, the United States gets involved in this war with Korea. Korea was divided after World War II. The northern part of Korea was occupied by the victorious Soviets during World War II, our allies during the war, and the southern part of Korea was occupied by the United States. Eventually, the North becomes pro-Soviet communist government. The South becomes an American ally. And civil war breaks out between the North invades the South. The American policy of containment, the strategy of containment, said, remember, it was a zero-sum game. If the Soviets and their allies with the North Koreans, now remember, the Soviets weren't actually fighting, they were giving money and weapons to the North Koreans. If the North Koreans win, that is a win for communism. That is a win for communist ideology. So the Americans, through the auspices of NATO, start to try and push the North Koreans back. But the United States always had to worry about escalation. By 1950, the Chinese had now also gone communist. Now, by the time that happens, there's nothing the Americans really feel like they could do. The United States was not going to invade such a large country like China over this issue. But just north of the Korean Peninsula is China. And the Chinese warned the Americans, if you do not come up to North Korea, that is on our border, it will make us very nervous. And as the Americans have success with their NATO allies of pushing the North Koreans above the original dividing line between North and South Korea, the Americans start to get the idea, well, maybe we could roll back communism on the entire North Korean peninsula, unify North Korea and South Korea, and make the entire singular country an ally of the United States. Well, the Chinese had warned the Americans, don't do that. The Americans did it, and then one day China invades North Korea, and now the Americans are not only fighting the North Koreans, but also the Chinese, a much larger, much more powerful nation. Now, if the Americans wanted to put their full might into this war, could the Americans have defeated both the North Koreans and the Chinese? Yes. But the Americans didn't do that because they were fearful if the United States went to war with China, then the Soviets would start to intervene and support the Chinese, and then maybe this leads to nuclear war. So throughout, we're going to, by the way, and we will see this similar dynamic happen in the Vietnam War in the next decade. The Americans were fighting wars during the Cold War, Korea, Vietnam, and could have used more soldiers and sailors and Marines, used heavier weaponry, even used nuclear weapons, but did not because of fear of escalation. There was something uncomfortable about this, something unsatisfying about this for the American people during the Cold War. Look, they remembered back to World War II. Hey, during World War II, we threw everything at the enemy we had. We converted our entire economy, changed our entire domestic way of life, sent women into factories to work, sent millions of men across the globe to fight this war. When we invented new weapons like nuclear weapons, we used them immediately. And now we're stuck in wars in Korea, far less powerful nations. And we're fighting these wars to a stalemate. The Korean War basically ends in a stalemate. The Americans lose the war in Vietnam. And as time goes on, there's something that is hard for the American public to understand. Why aren't we winning these wars? We had just defeated the Germans not long ago. The Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese combined And we can't defeat the North Koreans? We can't defeat the North Vietnamese? Now, again, there was a rational explanation for why the United States was calculating its power. You could understand that on an intellectual level. But as these wars dragged on, as Americans fought and died in these countries, places that many Americans couldn't even point out in a map. Where's Korea? Where's Vietnam? In these countries, it was easy to understand why the Americans fought the Japanese. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. The Japanese started the war. The Germans and Italians were allies and declared war on the United States. That was easy to understand. What did the North Koreans do to the Americans? Well, they were communists, and they were spreading communist ideology. And again, America, okay, yes, that's bad. That's bad. Is it bad enough to want to risk my son to go and die there? Some Americans said very much so. Yes, it's worth that. Others, and as we get to Vietnam, and as things go even worse in Vietnam than before, once again, what did the Vietnamese ever do to us? Do I want to go and fight and die there? Do I want my child to go and fight and die over there? Things become more ambiguous about these wars. And so Brad Wright, in your book, tracks this growing disenchantment with foreign wars and the greater sense of ambiguity about these wars reflected in comic books. So you go from the gung-ho G.I. Joe, making warfare look almost fun, to grittier, more pessimistic vision. This comic here is not a G.I. Joe comic. This is one from the Korean War era. And there's a greater sense of sort of dread and uselessness of warfare. Look at the clean-shaven boy next door look reflected in the G.I. Joe comic books. And then the later comic books where a grittier looking soldier, unshaven, bags under his eyes, a more grim vision of warfare. So go back and make sure you understand Brad Wright's argument about the growing disenchantment that Americans had with aspects of the Cold War and military intervention during the Cold War. The Cold War, however, was not simply to be fought and won on the field of battle, however. And the Soviet threat was not simply that they were going to invade the United States and take the United States over militarily. There was also the possibility that the Soviets could win without ever firing a shot, or at least that was the perception. And this had to do with the idea that the United States could be invaded with ideas, not simply bullets and bombs. The threat of communist ideology seeping into the United States, like a form, like a disease, like a virus that would start small and infect the nation and spread and metastasize and take over the nation. That that communism not only needed to be challenged and defeated externally, but the United States needed to make itself resistant to communist ideology and ideas. One of the ways this could be done, or at least this was perception at the time, was through the maintenance of traditional gender roles. In the 40s, 50s, into the 1960s, there was this widespread belief that homosexuality was a form of deviancy, a form of perversion. And that communism was also a form of deviancy, a form of perversion. No rational person could choose to be a communist. Somehow your mind had been messed up and you became a communist. And because these were both forms of perversion, they must somehow also be connected. That the tendency to become a communist also made you more susceptible to being gay. And being gay made you more susceptible to becoming a communist. Now, neither of these were forms of perversion, and neither of these were connected in any sort of way. This is not how either homosexuality or communism work. You can say communism is bad, but that doesn't make it a perversion of the mind. You're taking it too far. And there certainly was no connection between communism and homosexuality. If that was the case, it would be hard to explain why a country like China that was approaching 1 billion people was communist. I mean, China didn't turn gay. It didn't make any sense. But nonetheless, I mean, this was believed. This was a widespread belief. And the dominant explanation for why people became gay in the post-war period was gender confusion. A boy grew up in a household in which mom was too strong and too dominant. Dad was weak and effeminate. And the child growing up in that environment becomes confused and doesn't know how to assign his own gender. And therefore, he becomes gay. Same thing with a girl. Mom's too strong, dad's too weak, girl becomes gay. Girl becomes confused. Okay, once again, this is not how it works. If that's how it worked, it would be easy to identify which people were going to become gay. Entire households of children, a family of 8, you would get 6, 7, 8 kids. They would all go gay. But that's not how it works. That's not how it works. But nonetheless, because this was the perception, there was a great emphasis in the post-war period of traditional gender roles. Fathers had to be strong and dominant. Men had to be strong and dominant. Women had to be submissive and deferential. Men needed to go out and work. Women needed to stay home. Gender roles had to be very clear. Now, we already talked about this a bit when we talked about romance comics. And one of the ways you need to think about romance comic books is within the context of trying to prevent communist infiltration by making sure the next generation of children, the next generation of boys and girls grow up heterosexual, grow up straight, so they can resist communist perversion. And we see this play out in comic books. So there were romance comic books with girls offering traditional gender roles. There were lots of, for example, cowboy comic books. And we see this throughout American culture, by the way, not just comic books. In 1958, there were over 20 primetime television shows that centered around cowboys. 28 shows, or more than 20 shows just about cowboys, this masculine American hero. There was this real emphasis, both in comic books and throughout American culture, of showing men as being strong and dominant and women as being weak and submissive. All right. So we see this reflected, in various forms of comic books that the threat of communism, and one of the ways to combat communism was on the home front, to keep communism out by maintaining strong gender roles. Okay, everybody, that's a good place to stop our discussion on the Cold War. We'll see you next time. Bye.